If you wanted to get the most out of any body part, you wouldn't confine it to a cast, but that is essentially what most shoes are doing to our feet, making them stiff and weak. The 33 joints in each foot were made to move, and so you need shoes that let them. That means shoes that are foot-shaped, flat, flexible, fixed to your foot, and thin enough so that you can feel the ground beneath you. We call it natural footwear because it allows our feet to function naturally. But the longer you've been wearing that cast, the longer it will take to restore that function. And in this case, slow and steady really does win the race. First step is to show your feet some love. They need gentle movement and load first, so build a daily foot training habit. And when you're out and about in your shoes, it's important to start small and build up gradually. Walk before you run. Expose your feet to different surfaces and textures, and keep building your strength, mobility, and coordination as you progress. This may all sound a bit tedious, but the right tools and training can make it fun and simple. Plus, the freedom to explore makes it all worthwhile. All right, so it's helpful to think about footwear as clothing for our feet. And just like with clothing, there's an element of protection from the elements, cold, hot, things stabbing you. Armor, I guess, is like another form of clothing that is specifically used for protection. So just like that, we've got shoes and footwear that are used for protection, but also have fashion sort of purposes. And over time, footwear, was primarily about protection, and over time became more about fashion, which is quite interesting. And if you think about fashionable clothes, you have things like tight dresses and suits and things like that, which restrict the body's movement, and that you don't get to express the full natural capacity of your body in that clothing, because it's really for fashion, not for function. So you don't wear a suit to go to the gym because you're not able to move your body the way it sort of needs to move in order to exercise and function optimally. So similarly, interestingly, shoes, especially modern conventional athletic shoes, have kind of become more about fashion than function, and they certainly don't promote the natural function of your foot. So this is an example of something that we would refer to as sort of unnatural footwear, because it doesn't allow that natural function. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Under Armour here. This was just one that we found in the Lost and Found box. Hopefully forever lost, never found. But no offense particularly to Under Armour. Pretty much all conventional athletic shoes have these kinds of qualities, which are a thick cushioned heel like this, which sort of gives rise to that sort of positive elevation where the heel is over the toes, but also they've got this toe spring where, because the shoe is rigid, which is another aspect of conventional shoes, they need this to sort of act like your big toe, because your big toe extension is limited. So that means the shoe kind of acts like this rocker, and you don't get that natural movement of the big toe, and your ankle is also limited and doesn't go into as much dorsiflexion. The other aspect of that is the toe box, which is narrow, which squishes all your toes together. So that's just an example. Countless other examples of countless other brands that make this kind of footwear. And what we're sort of getting at when we talk about natural footwear is that it allows the natural function, and we have a system of categorizing that in terms, we call it the 5 Fs, and I'll just go through them using these shoes as an example. So the 5 Fs, it's kind of like a spectrum, or there is a spectrum between natural and unnatural, so it's not black and white. This would be sort of fairly far towards the spectrum of unnatural, and something like a Vibram is really far towards the spectrum of natural, but you do have things in between, and we like to view these 5 Fs as a bit of a hierarchy. So for example, we've got something like this, which is foot-shaped, which is the first F that we refer to and we feel is probably the most important F, along with fixed, which I'll just talk about in a second. But foot-shaped really just means it's widest at the tips of the toes. Even wide conventional shoes these days, if they're labeled as wide, they tend to be wide at the sort of base of the toes, and they still taper into a point. But if you see here, it's actually widest at the tips of the toes, and that allows for that natural toe splay, really important for arch function and balance, things that we've discussed before. So foot-shaped is really key there, and obviously if you look at that Vibram, that is literally foot-shaped in the sense that your toes are all separated. It's like wearing a glove for your foot. Now it's funny that that sort of gets looked at as like really weird shoes when you don't really think twice about someone wearing a glove with separated fingers, but you see that in the street and you're like, wow, that's a weird shoe. It's actually foot shaped. But so that's the most foot shaped, but really the key, and that has more benefits than just being sort of wide at the tips of the toes, but as long as your toes aren't being squished, that's the key there. So then we've got flat. Now, again, this is like an example of very obviously and purely flat, where there is no elevation from the heel down and also none of that toe spring. Now, another example is like a neutral drop where it actually looks like there is a little bit of a heel there and there is a little bit of that toe spring. So technically it's heel to toe is at the same level. So that's a neutral drop. And this is where you sort of get into that realm of a transition shoe or a shoe that is a tool for your feet to sort of get through their day, or for you to get through your day while they're still building back up their natural function, which we're going to talk about towards later in the video. But that flat aspect is pretty important to build towards, and there are shoes that are foot shaped but also have a little bit of a heel. So that's another example of a transition. Then you go down the line into less cushioning, still neutral drop and less of that toe spring. Again, you can just go further down that line when it comes to flat. Then you've got flexible. So I was showing before how that's rigid. Something like this Ultra is less rigid. You can twist it around like that. You can even fold it up. And that just allows the natural movement of the joints. There's 33 joints in the feet. So flexibility is really important to allow that natural movement. And again, the Vibram is the most flexible. Something I didn't mention, which sort of comes towards the top is, or I did mention but didn't explain, is fixed. So fixed to your foot is basically the difference between these two bits of footwear. So everyone's pretty familiar with a thong or a flip. In Australia we call them thongs, otherwise probably flip-flops or jandals, depending on where you're from. But that is just a slip-on shoe. You can see here it's like fairly foot-shaped, relatively similar shape. There's nothing confining your toes, so that's good. But it isn't fixed to your foot by this back strap. And so that means when your feet are in there, as you walk, you sort of have to flex your toes like that in order to keep the shoe or the sandal on. And that just disrupts your efficiency, basically. So having this back strap actually makes a big difference in terms of allowing and promoting natural foot function. So that's worth mentioning as a very important factor. So we've got foot shaped, fixed, flat, flexible, and the last one is feel, and that is just referring to how much distance between your foot and the ground there is, which makes all the difference in terms of how much sensation you get from the ground. So again, that's obviously a very thick heel. That's like a cushion underneath your foot, and you're not getting anywhere near the amount of information that you should be getting into your foot so that it can adapt to the ground. That's less cushioning, less, until you get into, that's actually more cushioning than a Vibram. It's sort of pulling at hairs there, but you get the idea. That's still some cushioning between you and the ground. And this is like barely any, but still some protection. So you can see there that there's, a spectrum between sort of almost fully unnatural to almost fully natural, and each of those characteristics can be tweaked depending on where your foot is in the process. And as you move from that spectrum, then you actually start to apply a lot more load to the feet, and this is why we talk about having a transition towards natural footwear, because just like any body part, if you've rested it, or if you have generally been quite physically inactive or sedentary, you've been on the couch for the last few decades, and you go straight out into the gym or straight out for a long run, you're probably going to get hurt. So it's the same kind of thing here with feet. If you've been on a cushion like this and your movement's been restricted in this sort of cast, and you jump straight into doing all your activities or doing more activities in something that provides a lot less support and cushioning, then it'll be likely too much load for your feet to handle. And so we talk about having a transition where you are either spending a little bit of time in something like this and gradually building up your time, or gradually moving your way down this spectrum on this hierarchy of naturalness, or those 5 Fs. So when we talk about how to do that, it's really up to you, and it depends on how you function barefoot at home. If you have any pain, kind of injury conditions, anything like that, then that will change how you should do this. And really, if you do have a pain or an injury that you're working with or struggling with, then your best bet is to go and get individualized assessment and guidance from a health professional. And we do have a growing directory of TFC pros on our website that you can go and check out. There'll be a link down below to do that, because everyone is very different. And if you're dealing with an irritable foot or ankle or anything really, and your footwear changes the symptoms that you get, then you'll want to be working with someone to help individualize your process. But as a general rule, you do want to be doing some kind of foot-focused training to improve your toe splay, your big toe extension, your midfoot mobility and control, your ankle mobility, your foot strength. All of these things are very important when it comes to building your capacity to tolerate load, which is exactly what you need in this more natural footwear. And we do have videos for all of those things in our TFC training playlist that you can start to work through, all completely free, very simple, accessible training videos. And so the idea is that you're doing that at the same time as building on this transition. Now, if you're someone who is going for like a transition shoe, then that's where that hierarchy comes into play. Like I said, you might, if you're, if you've been in orthotics and supportive shoes for decades and you're really used to a heel and your calves are really tight, then moving into something that does have a little bit of a heel but is foot shaped is really important. So fixed and foot shaped are basically never going to cause you an issue, and will probably move you towards fixing issues even if you just switch straight away. So there's absolutely no problem with just switching straight away to foot shaped and fixed. The flat will just create more of a load and a stimulus onto your ankle and Achilles tendon, as well as your big toe, because you're actually having to use those a lot more now. The flexible will, the more flexible it is, so let's say, we move from this kind of flexibility to this kind of flexibility, that's going to create more demand again on your big toe, especially because as you move through there, you can see there's going to be more movement happening at your big toe. It needs to happen at the big toe, whereas here you're sort of a little bit cushioned from that. So that's the flat, then the flexible, and then the thin. Once you go from this level of cushioning down to say that level of cushioning, or even lower, or even onto this Vivo, then you're going to be receiving a lot more texture and stimulus from the ground, and even just how heavy your foot strikes are on the ground, you'll really feel the difference. On your heel as you're walking, or on your midfoot, forefoot if you're running, you're going to receive a lot more load from the ground, and your foot actually needs to learn how to interact more intelligently and gently with the ground. Because if you're used to cushioning, you're actually hitting the ground a lot harder, or probably hitting the ground a lot harder, because those signals from the ground are being blocked. And then once you go barefoot a lot more, or you go into these shoes, then hitting the ground with the same amount of force is going to feel really uncomfortable, and it's probably going to eventually cause issues. So you need to lighten how much load you're putting into the ground, and learn how to absorb more of that force with the foot itself rather than relying on the cushioning. So it can seem a bit overwhelming and complicated, but just pick a strategy and get started. And then the key is self-regulation, because there's not really anyone in the world that can tell you exactly what's going to work well for you. Your body will tell you though, and it's good to start smaller than you think and take notes as you go, but really your body is going to give you the feedback that you need. So if you start with, say, an hour in a transition shoe and it goes really well, then you could think about going 2 hours. Or if it's a 10-minute walk in something like this and that goes really well, then you can go to 20 minutes or 15 minutes and just very gradually build. And over time, you write down in your diary, okay, I did 15 minutes, feet felt great, going to go to 20 minutes tomorrow or next week. Or did half an hour, and last week I did 15 minutes, did half an hour today, and my feet were really sore for a few hours afterwards. I'm going to do less. I'm going to go back less. So it's just a trial and error, becoming your own scientist, figuring out what works for you. And as you go along, especially as you start training your feet, you'll be surprised how quickly you are able to progress. But it's just very important and intelligent to be conservative at first, because the line of progression will be a lot smoother if you're not sort of doing way too much and then having to back way off, and then way too much, back way off. If you just sort of do little, it's never going to be completely smooth, but if you're just doing a little bit more, a little bit less, a little bit more, a little bit less, and up like that, that's a really, it's a smoother way to do it and it's less frustrating. So obviously, we're here as a resource to help you with all that training, to connect you with professionals in our community and our network, and also with people who are on the same journey. So we do have our digital community that you can join if you want to connect with other people who are on this sort of foot freedom journey and this transition to natural footwear. But yeah, expect there to be bumps along the way, but that doesn't mean that the unnatural. It doesn't mean that you're sentenced to a lifetime in unnatural shoes necessarily. It just means that there's an obstacle to overcome, and for the vast majority of people there is always a way to overcome that obstacle. So keep at it, stay persistent, and try and enjoy the process. And by the time you get to these this realm of like much more natural footwear, you will be feeling a lot more confident in your feet, stronger in your feet, more mobile, and you'll just have a lot more freedom to do the activities that you want to do without relying on all of this external support and without restricting all the function of your foot. Another thing worth mentioning is, obviously, it's one thing to say, XYZ footwear is good for you or natural footwear is good for you. But another thing is making it suit your style and your budget, because if it doesn't suit those two things, then you're very unlikely to wear them. So we are focusing heavily on partnering with natural footwear brands of different styles, different budgets. Not everyone's going to enjoy going into a Vibram shape like that. I love them. But there are an amazing amount of brands coming out now that have much more sort of normal looking footwear that do adhere to those 5Fs, or at least most of those 5Fs. So we've got all of our natural footwear partners on a webpage that you can go and check out. You can shop for different styles, different budgets that suit you. And we also have discount codes with the majority of them that you can use in order to save yourself a few dollars, and that actually supports us in the process as well. So check out that natural footwear page. This is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot more on there. So yeah, shop around, find what suits you, and get going.